The house on Lakeshore Avenue looked like a promise made to strangers. Its lawn was trimmed into a calm, obedient green, edged so sharply it seemed cut by a ruler. White window frames caught the pale Seattle light and held it, reflecting clouds and tree branches like a postcard. A porch swing hung still, decorative more than used, and the front door wore a brass knocker polished often enough to suggest that appearances were maintained the way some people maintained faith. Inside, the air carried a different truth. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood, and the family photographs along the wall were arranged with careful symmetry. In every frame, everyone stood close, smiles practiced, bodies angled as if they had been placed by someone with a measuring tape. Nora Keller had learned early that these pictures were not memories. They were evidence. Proof that the family was intact, that nothing had ever gone wrong behind those white frames. She was 8 and quiet in the way children became quiet when sound brought consequences. She moved lightly across the floors, toes finding the softest boards, and she had mastered the art of watching without being seen. It was not a game. It was survival shaped into habit. She had learned to read the house the way other children read books. She read pauses, the way silence thickened before a door slammed. She read footsteps, the pace that meant impatience, the heavier rhythm that meant anger. She read her mother's breathing, the sigh that came when the day had demanded too much from her. Henry Keller belonged to the outward face of the house. He wore suits that smelled of dry cleaning and money, and he spoke with the confidence of men who believed the world existed to respond. He left early and returned late, bringing home the faint metallic scent of elevators, leather interiors, and social rooms filled with laughter that never reached the eyes. His life was composed of meetings, handshakes, charity dinners where his name appeared on printed programs. He moved through his own home the way he moved through those rooms, as if everything around him was an extension of his status. May Keller belonged to what people never photographed. She kept the kitchen clean, the floors shining, the calendar organized. She smiled at neighbors and nodded at polite questions. She answered always that everything was fine. In the privacy of the house, her fine looked like exhaustion carefully arranged. Her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was watching. Her eyes held a fatigue that had nowhere to go. She lived on thin sleep and thick silence, and she gave her tenderness in small doses, as if saving it was the only way to make it last. Nora sensed the third presence long before she had words for it. At first, it was only an absence that entered the room with her father, a shift in his posture when he checked his phone, a sudden tightness in the air when May asked a question that sounded too ordinary. Then it became details that did not belong. A perfume Nora couldn't place, sweet and expensive, clinging to the collar of her father's coat. A long strand of hair on the backseat of his car, darker than May's. A faint smear of lipstick on a glass in the sink that May scrubbed until her knuckles went pale. Children noticed what adults tried to bury. Nora noticed the way her mother's laughter grew rarer, thinner, like a candle being used up. She noticed how her father's gaze sometimes passed through May as if she were already gone. She noticed the way her mother started locking her bedroom door at night, a small act that carried no real power but contained a refusal. The house learned to hold that refusal, pressing it between its walls until it felt like a pressure that never released. The night everything broke arrived without ceremony. Seattle's rain came down fine and persistent, turning the street into a mirror that fractured the streetlights. Water tapped gently against the windows as if trying to be let in. Nora had been half asleep when she heard the front door. Not the careful entry her father used when he wanted to appear considerate, but a louder opening, the kind that assumed the house would accept whatever he brought into it. She lay still, listening. The hallway light flickered under her door and footsteps moved past her room toward the master bedroom. There was another set of steps, lighter, unfamiliar. Nora sat up slowly, heart picking up speed in a way that made her feel older than 8. She called softly for her mother at first, then louder, the words catching in her throat when no answer came. The silence from her mother's room felt wrong. It was not the normal exhausted quiet. It was a void. She pushed the door open. The air inside was cooler than it should have been. May lay on her side, facing away, hair spread across the pillow like a dark stain. Nora touched her arm, expecting warmth, expecting movement, expecting irritation. Her mother's skin was cold. Not the cool of a room in winter, but the cold of something that had stopped being alive. Nora's mind tried to reject it. It insisted on simple explanations. Her mother was sleeping deeply. Her mother was angry. Her mother would wake if Nora tried hard enough. Nora tried harder. She shook her gently, then more urgently. She watched her mother's face for any sign of breath. The house stayed silent, indifferent. Nora's hands began to tremble, and the fear that filled her did not feel like fear at first. It felt like rage, a raw and helpless force that wanted to be thrown at something solid. From her father's room, sounds leaked into the hallway. They were not words, not anything Nora could understand with her mind, but they were unmistakably adult. Harsh breathing, the creak of a bed, a muffled laugh. It was the sound of someone taking what they wanted in a house where a child still believed mothers were supposed to be safe. Nora moved down the hall as if pulled by that rage. Her feet were bare on cold floorboards. She approached the master bedroom door and hit it with her small fists until her knuckles stung. She did not know what she expected to change. She only knew she could not remain in silence while her world collapsed behind her and something obscene continued in front of her. The door opened sharply. Henry's face appeared, irritated, eyes focused not on Nora's panic but on her interruption. Behind him, the room smelled like unfamiliar perfume, heavy and sweet, layered over the sharper scent of alcohol. The woman inside was half hidden by shadow and a sheet, hair spilled over her shoulders, lips curved in a smile that did not belong in that house. Nora's gaze landed on a necklace at the woman's throat. It was not just similar to her mother. It was her mother. Nora recognized the small pendant, the way it rested against the skin. A part of her, still clinging to child logic, decided that if she could take it back, she could reverse what had happened. Her hands reached for it before she knew she had moved. Everything after that turned into a blur of adult hands and sharp motion. There was a slap that rang in her ears. There was pain on her cheek, sudden heat, then numbness. The woman's face twisted with outrage, and her father's voice rose, not in concern for Nora, but in anger at the inconvenience. Someone grabbed Nora's wrist hard enough to leave marks. Someone called her something she did not fully understand, but felt in her bones as contempt. Nora looked at her father then, truly looked, and saw a stranger. Not the man from the photographs. Not the father who smiled at charity events. A man whose priorities had already been chosen, whose affection was conditional, whose power required obedience even from a child. She tried to speak, to tell him her mother would not wake up, that her hand was cold, that something was wrong beyond this room. But the house was full of noise now, and her words were swallowed by it. The adults were busy with their own conflict, their own dominance, their own need to control the narrative. Nora's truth did not fit their story, so it was ignored. When dawn arrived, it did not bring relief. It brought an announcement delivered through practical movements. Doors opened. Phones rang. A stranger's footsteps moved through the hall. The house shifted into a new mode, efficient and cold. May was dead. The fact was handled like an item on a list, something to process quickly so life could continue uninterrupted. Nora stood in the hallway, still in her night clothes, cheek burning, knuckles raw, and understood something that would shape her for years. Death did not stop people who wanted to keep living as they pleased. Love did not protect. Truth did not matter if it threatened the image. The house on Lakeshore Avenue remained beautiful from the outside. The lawn stayed trimmed. The frames stayed white. The photographs stayed straight. And inside, a child's childhood ended quietly, not with a single dramatic moment, but with the slow realization that no one was coming to save her. Grief did not arrive as a stopping force. It arrived as a corridor. The day of May Keller's funeral unfolded with mechanical efficiency, as if the house on Lakeshore Avenue had already rehearsed the sequence. Nora was dressed in black that felt borrowed, fabric stiff against her skin, shoes too polished for a child who wanted to curl inward and disappear. Adults moved around her with careful hands and distant expressions, speaking in low tones that never included her. Their condolences brushed past her like cold air, touching without landing. She learned quickly that sorrow, when properly managed, became a performance rather than an experience. The church smelled of lilies and polished wood. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the pews with colors that felt inappropriate, too alive for a day meant to honor someone who no longer breathed. Nora sat still, feet barely touching the floor, hands folded because someone had placed them that way. Her father occupied the front row, posture straight, face composed into an expression that suggested loss without vulnerability. He did not look back. He did not reach for her hand. His grief, if it existed, was private in the way wealth and authority often were. Nora watched the coffin as if it might open, as if her mother might still be negotiating with whatever force had taken her, trying to find her way back. She waited for something to feel final. It did not. Everything felt suspended, as though the world had decided to pause only long enough to check a box before moving on. The burial followed quickly. Earth struck wood with a dull sound that settled into Nora's chest and stayed there. Adults cried softly. Some did not cry at all. The ritual completed itself without incident, and by the time the last flower was placed, the air had already begun to shift. The tension that had filled the house before May's death did not dissipate. It rearranged. By the next morning, mourning had been repurposed. Henry Keller announced his intention with the same calm certainty he used when making business decisions. The woman from the night before entered the house in daylight, no longer a shadowed presence but a visible fact. Vivienne arrived not as a guest but as an answer, carrying herself with a confidence that suggested inevitability. Her clothing was tasteful, her movements measured, her gaze assessing. She walked through the living room as if memorizing it, touching furniture lightly, already claiming space without needing permission. Nora watched from the stairs, unnoticed. She saw how the house responded. The air felt different, tighter, as though something had settled into its foundations. Vivienne did not hesitate or falter. She behaved like someone returning rather than arriving, and that familiarity unsettled Nora more than open hostility would have. Skylar followed close behind. She was older than Nora by several years, tall and thin, her expression alert in a way that suggested calculation rather than curiosity. Her eyes moved quickly, taking inventory. When they landed on Nora, they did not soften. They sharpened. There was no warmth in her assessment, only interest, as if she had identified a weakness and filed it away for later use. The wedding occurred with almost insulting speed. It was small, efficient, and timed conveniently enough to avoid extended attention. Nora was present because appearances required it. She stood where she was placed, held still when adjusted, and learned that mourning could be overridden by logistics. Her father's grief had already been replaced by a new alignment, one that promised order and control rather than uncertainty. Vivienne assumed authority immediately. The household rules changed without announcement, delivered instead through subtle enforcement. Nora's routines were altered. Her room was reorganized without her consent, belongings shifted to make space for Skylar's things. Her meals were monitored closely, portions controlled, preferences dismissed. Food became conditional, praise rare and calculated. Care was offered in ways that felt invasive rather than nurturing. Medication appeared without explanation. Small pills placed beside her breakfast, justified by vague references to health and balance. Nora did not know what they were meant to correct. She only knew how they made her feel, slower, quieter, more compliant. When she hesitated, she was reminded that resistance was unnecessary and ungrateful. Concern became a tool. Obedience became the expectation. Skylar observed and learned quickly. She mirrored her mother's tone, her timing, her ability to inflict discomfort without leaving evidence. She targeted what Nora valued most. Small objects went missing. Toys were damaged beyond repair. A drawing disappeared from the refrigerator, replaced by something Skylar had made. When Nora reacted, even slightly, the reaction itself was treated as the problem. Nora was not beaten in the way stories often described. She was diminished. Her voice was discouraged, then ignored. Her tears were framed as inconvenience. Her questions were met with reminders of how much trouble she caused. Over time, she began to associate silence with safety. She learned that stillness reduced attention, and attention led to pain. The only interruption to this process came from Bertha, the housekeeper who had been present for as long as Nora could remember. Bertha moved through the house with quiet efficiency and carried a softness that felt almost illicit in its contrast. She slipped extra food onto Nora's plate when she could. She lingered in doorways just long enough to create the illusion of supervision. She spoke with her eyes, offering reassurance she could not voice. Her presence unsettled Vivienne. One afternoon, Bertha was simply gone. Her name was not spoken again. When Nora asked, she was told it was necessary for order. The explanation was delivered with finality, and Nora understood that questions themselves were a liability. Bertha's disappearance taught her a lesson she would not forget. Witnesses did not last. The house adjusted smoothly to the change. Tasks were redistributed. Silence filled the spaces Bertha had occupied. Nora felt something collapse inside her, a fragile belief that someone might intervene if things became unbearable. That belief left quietly, without protest. Months passed. Seasons shifted outside the white-framed windows. Inside, Nora became more efficient at being invisible. She learned the rhythms of Vivienne's moods, the signs that meant withdrawal was safer than presence. She learned when Skylar was bored, which was the most dangerous state of all. She learned to anticipate punishment disguised as correction. By the end of the year, tears no longer came easily. When they did, she swallowed them quickly, forcing her face into neutrality. Emotional expression became something she performed only in private, and even then with caution. The house rewarded control. It punished vulnerability. Nora adapted because adaptation was the only available option. She did not forget her mother, but the memory retreated into a quieter place, protected from contamination. Love became something she associated with loss, and loss with exposure. To survive, she needed to reduce herself. The funeral had not marked an ending. It had marked a transition. The pause that grief was supposed to provide had never existed. Life had continued, sharpened and reorganized around new priorities, and a child had been reshaped to fit them. By the time Nora stopped crying altogether, she no longer recognized the version of herself who believed that death should slow the world. The house on Lakeshore Avenue had taught her otherwise. It taught her that momentum belonged to those who took it, and that morning, like everything else, could be repurposed if it stood in the way. 10 years reshaped Nora Keller with the quiet efficiency of pressure applied consistently over time. She grew into a version of herself that pleased the household precisely because it asked for nothing. Beauty arrived without drama, sharpened by restraint rather than indulgence. Her movements were economical, her posture composed, her expressions carefully moderated. Teachers praised her discipline. Neighbors admired her manners. At home, this polish was interpreted as success. She had learned exactly how much presence was acceptable and how much absence was required to remain unpunished. Silence became her native language. She answered questions fully but briefly, anticipating what was expected before it was voiced. Her grades were immaculate, not because ambition burned within her, but because excellence functioned as camouflage. Achievement reduced scrutiny. Obedience reduced friction. Nora understood this intuitively long before she could have articulated it. Survival had taught her efficiency. Henry Keller began to see her differently as she approached adulthood. The shift was subtle, revealed not through affection but through attention. He reviewed her schedules, inquired about her studies with a focus that felt less paternal than strategic. Her future was no longer discussed in terms of fulfillment or interest. It was discussed in terms of alignment. Nora sensed the recalibration and did not resist it openly. Resistance had never served her well. Vivienne guided the process with patience sharpened by long intention. She framed concern as guidance, opportunity as obligation. She spoke often of responsibility, of legacy, of gratitude for what the family provided. Nora listened, absorbing the narrative without adopting it emotionally. She recognized the structure beneath the words. Her compliance was interpreted as agreement, and that misunderstanding became her shield. The assets left by Nora's mother hovered constantly in the background, unspoken but ever-present. A minority stake in a pharmaceutical firm. Signature authority tied to a family fund structured in a way that delayed full control until Nora reached a certain age. These were not sentimental remnants of a lost parent. They were leverage. Vivienne never referred to them directly, but her planning revolved around them with careful precision. Everything Nora did was contextualized against what she represented on paper. Her value had been translated into numbers. Suitors appeared gradually, introduced through social functions designed to feel casual. Sons of influential families, heirs with polished resumes and curated charm. None lingered. None felt right. The exercise was not about choice. It was about narrowing the field until the correct solution remained. Nora understood this too. She observed without hope or disappointment, treating each interaction as another test she was expected to pass without revealing fatigue. Anthony Grace entered the narrative with inevitability rather than excitement. His name carried weight long before his presence did. East Coast capital. Old money refined into modern dominance. His family's reach extended across industries and governments, woven into institutions that appeared neutral until examined closely. When he finally stood beside Nora, his demeanor was flawless. Attentive. Reserved. His interest felt measured, calibrated to what she could offer rather than who she was. She noted it immediately. The way his gaze lingered on conversations involving inheritance law. The questions he asked about her education that seemed designed to assess reliability rather than curiosity. The absence of warmth when no one was watching. Anthony did not dislike her. Dislike would have required emotional investment. He evaluated her. The engagement was arranged with impressive efficiency. Announced at precisely the right moment. Framed as a celebration of mutual compatibility and shared values. Nora wore the ring without trembling. The stone caught light beautifully, heavy enough to signal significance. People congratulated her as if she had won something rare. She smiled because smiling was easy. Inside, she treated the moment as a transaction finally formalized. Privately, she allowed herself a controlled hope. Marriage represented distance. A physical exit from the house on Lakeshore Avenue. A new surname that would place space between her and the architecture of her childhood. She imagined a future defined by neutrality rather than harm. Not happiness, just absence of pressure. That alone felt aspirational. The closer the wedding approached, the more transparent the structure became. Anthony's interest did not deepen. It clarified. He spoke with confidence about the future, but that future always included terms. Conditions. His expectations were reasonable on the surface. Discretion. Loyalty. Cooperation. What he wanted was predictability, and Nora embodied it perfectly. Vivienne watched the progression with satisfaction she did not bother to hide. Her approval manifested as gentler oversight, fewer corrections, a tone that suggested Nora was finally earning her place. Skylar's demeanor shifted as well. The open cruelty of adolescence gave way to something colder. She observed Nora now with amusement rather than hostility, as if the outcome had already been decided and resistance no longer posed a threat. The household treated the engagement as resolution. The problem of Nora Keller was nearing completion. Nora moved through this phase with heightened awareness. She noted the meetings conducted behind closed doors. The documents passed between Henry and Vivienne with urgency disguised as routine. The sudden interest in revisiting clauses of old trusts and dormant agreements. She was not privy to the details, but she understood enough to recognize momentum. Once set in motion, it would not stop for her comfort. Her body responded to the strain even as her mind remained controlled. Sleep became lighter. Appetite dulled. She experienced moments of dissociation during social gatherings, observing herself from a distance as if she were another asset being showcased. She corrected posture automatically, answered questions with precision, accepted compliments without reaction. This was what had been trained into her: efficiency over authenticity. Anthony never asked what she wanted. He assumed alignment where silence existed. That assumption was not accidental. It was foundational to the arrangement. Nora did not correct it. Correction implied agency, and agency was not part of her assigned role. As the wedding date solidified, she recognized the truth she had been avoiding. Marriage was not an escape. It was a transfer. Authority would change hands, but the structure would remain intact. Her autonomy would not increase. It would simply be managed by someone else. The realization did not provoke panic. Panic required expectation of rescue. Nora had long abandoned that. Instead, she experienced a tightening resolve, not rebellion, awareness. She began to catalog details more carefully, noting where decisions originated and where they landed. She observed how people treated her when they believed the outcome was secured. That knowledge, she sensed, might someday matter. In the Keller household, happiness was never the objective. Stability was. Control was. The engagement represented consolidation, not union. Nora was the final component required to lock an arrangement into place, her presence legitimizing a structure built long before she was invited to understand it. She stood at the center of it all with practiced calm, beautiful and silent in precisely the way that made her most useful. And somewhere beneath that stillness, something began to shift. Not yet resistance, not yet escape, just the quiet accumulation of awareness that would, in time, demand resolution. The engagement evening unfolded as a carefully staged illusion, a ceremony designed to reassure investors, allies, and the broader social machinery that everything was proceeding according to plan. The venue glowed with controlled elegance. Crystal caught the light in calculated angles. Music filled the space without demanding attention, calibrated to suggest celebration rather than joy. Cameras moved discreetly, capturing images meant for circulation, evidence that the merger of two influential lines had been sealed. Nora stood at the center of it with practiced composure. The dress fit her perfectly, tailored to emphasize grace without suggesting individuality. Every detail had been selected to present her as ideal, polished, grateful, complete. She had learned long ago how to become an object that reflected approval back at its observers. Smiling required no effort. Stillness came naturally. Her body obeyed the rules even as her mind remained detached. She watched the evening from a distance that existed only internally. Faces blurred into categories rather than individuals. Some people mattered because they controlled capital. Others mattered because they carried narratives. Very few mattered because they were human. Anthony moved through the crowd with ease, accepting congratulations with a confidence that came from knowing the outcome benefited him regardless of how the details unfolded. He touched her arm when required, his gestures correct and empty, as if confirming ownership rather than connection. Vivienne observed everything with quiet satisfaction. Her posture suggested triumph that did not need to be announced. Schuyler lingered at the edges, appearing relaxed, amused even, as though she were waiting for a cue that only she could hear. The household's long preparation had reached its visible conclusion. The arrangement was being finalized in public, the last seal applied. The fracture occurred without drama. Nora excused herself briefly, moving away from the noise toward a corridor meant for staff and storage. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Music softened behind closed doors. The air grew cooler, stripped of performance. She walked without urgency, guided by instinct rather than intention, and arrived at a threshold where certainty replaced suspicion. What she witnessed was not ambiguous. It was not a misunderstanding or a moment taken out of context. Anthony and Schuyler occupied the space with familiarity that left no room for denial. Their proximity was deliberate, their body language practiced. This was not the first time. It was not accidental. It was a continuation. The recognition struck with surgical clarity. The pattern from her childhood reasserted itself, not as memory but as replication. The same structure, the same cruelty refined into repetition. Schuyler's expression carried satisfaction not derived from desire, but from precision. This was an act of dominance, a demonstration meant to reassert hierarchy. Anthony's demeanor revealed nothing but calculation. He was not reckless. He was efficient. He understood risk, and he understood value. Hurting Nora did not trouble him. Losing leverage did. Nora did not cry. Tears would have granted them something they did not deserve. Instead, a cold focus settled over her, sharp and unwavering. The years of restraint did not dissolve. They inverted. Rage did not explode outward. It condensed, turning inward into something controlled and deliberate. She withdrew without confrontation. The party continued uninterrupted. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. The illusion held. Later, in a quieter space, Nora attempted to sever the engagement. The response was immediate and ruthless. Concern was replaced by strategy. Henry did not ask what had happened. He evaluated the damage. Vivienne did not express surprise. She calculated containment. Schuyler watched with a faint smile, already certain of the outcome. The pressure arrived in layers. Legal implications were outlined with precision. Clauses were referenced. Timelines emphasized. Nora was reminded of what she owed, of what she represented. The assets tied to her mother's legacy were positioned as conditional, something that could be protected or stripped depending on her cooperation. Reputation was framed as fragile. Silence as responsibility. They did not ask her to reconsider. They informed her that reconsideration was not an option. The sense of betrayal sharpened into something else when the next revelation surfaced. A medical appointment, scheduled under the guise of routine, delivered a result that fractured reality entirely. Pregnancy was confirmed with clinical certainty. The words landed without context, floating briefly before anchoring into her body with terrifying permanence. For Nora, the result felt impossible. It contradicted everything she knew of her own life, her choices, her boundaries. The conclusion resisted logic. Shock gave way to disbelief, then to a slow, creeping understanding that something fundamental had been taken from her without consent, whether she could trace the moment or not. For Henry and Vivienne, the pregnancy was not a tragedy. It was an inconvenience. Their reaction did not include concern for her well-being. It focused on impact. The timeline was immediately assessed. Options were discussed with the same detachment used for financial liabilities. The child was framed as an obstacle to be removed or concealed before it disrupted negotiations. Nora's body was treated as a variable that had failed to perform as expected. The pressure intensified. Her autonomy narrowed to nothing. She was reminded of her dependence, of the shelter provided, of the reputation being preserved. The implication was clear. Compliance was expected. Resistance would be punished not through violence, but through erasure. This time, something broke. Not loudly, not visibly. The internal mechanism that had kept Nora compliant for years finally failed. The seal that had contained her obedience cracked under the weight of accumulated violations. Fear did not vanish, but it was displaced. In its place emerged clarity. She understood, finally, that the system would never stop extracting from her. There would be no moment when enough had been taken. There would be no reward for endurance. The pregnancy had not created the threat. It had revealed it. Nora did not yet know how she would escape. She did not yet know where she would go or what she would become. But the narrative imposed on her had lost its authority. The illusion of inevitability dissolved. The engagement evening, designed to finalize her transfer, instead exposed the architecture of her captivity. The seal had been broken, not by rebellion, but by recognition. The knowledge settled into her bones with quiet certainty. What followed would not be negotiation. It would be departure. The arrangement that had defined her life could no longer contain her, because she no longer believed in it. And belief, she had learned too late, was the only thing that had ever kept her compliant. Everything accelerated after the seal broke. Pressure no longer disguised itself as concern or guidance. It arrived openly, stripped of pretense, framed as necessity. The family moved with a unified purpose, efficient and cold, treating the situation as a logistical failure that required immediate correction. Nora was no longer addressed as a person navigating a crisis. She was addressed as a malfunctioning variable. The pregnancy was categorized as an error. Timelines were recalculated, consequences mapped, solutions proposed with professional detachment. Her body became a site of negotiation, her future a project that needed to be brought back on schedule. The expectation was absolute compliance. There was no language for refusal in the framework they imposed. Resistance was defined as immaturity. Fear was assumed to be sufficient leverage. Nora listened without reacting. She absorbed the information the way she had learned to absorb pain, quietly, storing it somewhere inaccessible. She did not argue. She did not plead. She allowed them to believe their authority remained intact. That belief became her opening. The night she left was unremarkable in its execution. No dramatic confrontation preceded it. No goodbye was offered or expected. The house on Lakeshore Avenue slept in its accustomed stillness, confident in its control. Nora moved through it with the familiarity of someone who had memorized every sound it made. She avoided the boards that creaked. She paused when the air shifted. She carried only what could not be replaced: her identification documents and a single object that had survived untouched, a remnant of her mother's presence that still anchored her to herself. When the front door closed behind her, it did not announce the departure. The house did not protest. It had no reason to believe it was being abandoned. She traveled first without destination, guided by instinct rather than plan. Distance mattered more than direction. She crossed state lines before dawn, blending into the anonymity of highways and rest stops where no one asked questions. Oregon provided her first shelter, a small room rented under a temporary arrangement, a job that required labor rather than explanation. She learned quickly how to make herself unremarkable. Pregnancy altered her relationship with her body in ways that defied fear. What had been treated as a liability became a fact she could no longer deny or negotiate away. The reality of it grounded her. The child growing inside her was not abstract. It was present, demanding care, demanding endurance. The urgency of survival eclipsed everything else. She did not stay in one place long. Movement reduced traceability. From Oregon, she drifted south, eventually settling in California where scale itself offered camouflage. Cities swallowed identities without effort, records fragmented, histories blurred. Nora allowed herself to disappear fully. She changed her name with deliberation. The process was procedural, stripped of ceremony, but the effect was profound. Athena Reed replaced Nora Keller on every document that mattered. The old name became a liability she compartmentalized, something belonging to a different person whose life had concluded. Athena was not a reinvention. She was an erasure. Medical school demanded everything she had left. The workload was brutal, unrelenting, and impersonal. Athena welcomed it. Exhaustion became a shield, preventing reflection. Focus replaced fear. Discipline became protection. She excelled not from ambition, but from necessity. Failure would have exposed her. Success rendered her invisible in plain sight. Residency tested her limits further. Long shifts blurred days into nights. Sleep became fragmented. Pain was normalized. In the clinical environment, suffering had structure. It could be measured, treated, contained. Athena learned to operate within that structure with precision. Her capacity to endure became a professional asset. She gave birth under conditions she had prepared for meticulously. Not one child, but two. The revelation did not overwhelm her. It clarified her reality. The presence of twins transformed survival into purpose. There was no room for abstraction. Love, in this context, was not gentle or sentimental. It was vigilant. It was protective. It was ruthless when required. Motherhood did not soften Athena. It sharpened her. She learned to live with constant awareness, calculating risk instinctively. Who noticed her? Who asked questions? Which institutions required scrutiny? She avoided social exposure. She curated her circle narrowly. Trust was extended only where verification existed. Her children learned safety before play, routine before indulgence. Years passed without pause. The past did not pursue her openly, but it did not disappear. Occasionally, fragments surfaced. A name mentioned in an industry report, a familiar corporate logo on a pharmaceutical document, legal notices that skirted too close to old structures. Athena monitored these signals carefully, never reacting impulsively. She understood now how power moved. It did not rush. It waited. The question of the children's father remained unresolved, a constant low-frequency disturbance. The circumstances of her pregnancy defied easy explanation. Medical logic offered probabilities but no certainty. Athena reviewed records late at night, tracing timelines, searching for anomalies. The absence of clear answers disturbed her more than any single conclusion would have. She considered the possibility that the truth had been deliberately obscured. The thought did not frighten her. It angered her with precision. Her life stabilized outwardly. She built a reputation as a capable physician, disciplined and reserved. Colleagues respected her competence without knowing her history. Patients trusted her instinctively. Athena's manner conveyed authority without aggression. She did not waste words. She did not seek approval. Internally, she remained alert. She lived as if under conditional visibility, prepared to disappear again if necessary. Her identity rested not on name or status, but on function. She provided. She protected. She endured. The number 0 became her internal designation. No expectations, no attachment to recognition, no allowance for vulnerability. 0 was safe. 0 could not be leveraged. Yet even 0 accumulated weight over time. The unanswered questions persisted. The faint sense that her disappearance had not gone unnoticed lingered at the edges of her awareness. Power structures rarely lost assets permanently. They reclassified them. Athena did not romanticize her escape. It had cost her everything familiar. She accepted that cost without regret. The life she had left behind had been designed to consume her. The life she built required constant vigilance, but it belonged to her. As her children grew, she observed traces of something unfamiliar in them, expressions that mirrored nothing she recognized, a quiet confidence, an ease with presence. She studied them carefully, not with suspicion, but with attention sharpened by experience. Whatever their origin, they were hers to protect. The woman once called Nora Keller had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Athena Reed stood in her place, constructed from absence, discipline, and refusal. She did not consider herself reborn. She considered herself unowned. The name Zero remained unspoken, but it defined her posture toward the world. From zero, nothing could be taken. From zero, everything could be built deliberately. And somewhere beyond her controlled life, forces continued to move, unaware that the variable they believed erased had transformed into something far more dangerous than compliance. She did not yet move toward confrontation. That would come later, if at all. For now, survival remained the priority. Knowledge accumulated quietly. Strength consolidated without display. The woman named Zero endured, waiting not for rescue, but for the moment when understanding would demand action. Athena Reed returned to the United States without announcement, without ceremony, and without illusion. The country greeted her not as a homecoming, but as a familiar system that had continued functioning in her absence. Airports, highways, hospitals, institutions all operated with the same indifferent efficiency. She blended into it seamlessly, a trained professional with verified credentials, a history that existed on paper but revealed nothing of consequence. She was no longer the girl who had been removed from relevance. She was a physician with a reputation built quietly, deliberately, through years of competence rather than visibility. Her name carried weight in professional circles that valued outcomes over narratives. She had learned how to move inside systems without triggering attention, how to be essential without becoming exposed. Power, she understood now, was less about presence than about placement. Her return was motivated by neither nostalgia nor revenge. Those emotions belonged to an earlier version of herself, one that had not survived. Athena was guided by something colder and more precise. She needed truth, not closure, not reconciliation, truth as a structural necessity. There were gaps in her history that could no longer be ignored without risk, medical records that did not align, legal traces that suggested deliberate omission, references to a child that should not have existed within the official version of events. One of the twins had been taken from her. Not physically, not in the way theft was usually understood. The loss had been procedural, embedded in paperwork and authority, disguised as protection, reframed as inevitability. The more Athena examined the fragments, the clearer it became that her pregnancy had been monitored, categorized, and repurposed by forces operating beyond her immediate family. What had happened was not a consequence of chaos. It was the result of intent. Her mother's pharmaceutical company resurfaced as the central axis around which everything turned. Once a modest but innovative enterprise, it had become an object of aggressive interest. Shareholders maneuvered quietly. Legal challenges emerged with suspicious timing. Shell entities appeared and dissolved. Athena recognized the pattern immediately. This was not standard acquisition behavior. It was extraction. Someone wanted control. Someone wanted leverage. And someone believed Athena Reed was either expendable or recoverable. She reviewed the company's history late into the nights, reconstructing the years she had been absent. Management decisions made in her name without her consent. Clauses activated precisely when she reached legal thresholds. Trust structures modified under the guise of compliance. The architecture was familiar. It resembled the house on Lakeshore Avenue, scaled up and institutionalized. The same logic, different walls. The name Justin Hunt emerged repeatedly, not as an antagonist but as a constant. His family's presence threaded through financial disclosures, philanthropic boards, medical research foundations. Their influence did not assert itself overtly. It permeated. Athena understood this kind of power instinctively. It behaved like weather, shaping outcomes without needing to announce itself. She did not seek him out. The encounter occurred through proximity rather than intention, in a space where exposure was assumed to be controlled. A private terminal, a restricted medical wing, a setting designed to eliminate randomness. Athena noticed the child first, a boy with posture too composed for his age, eyes that held attention rather than seeking it. Something in his presence registered immediately, an internal recognition she could not justify. The familiarity was not sentimental. It was physiological. She observed him the way she observed patients in moments of diagnostic clarity, when instinct preceded confirmation. The symmetry of his features, the way he processed his surroundings, the quiet confidence that mirrored nothing she had seen before but felt unmistakably aligned with her own children. The realization unsettled her more than fear would have. Justin Hunt entered her awareness not as a man, but as a force adjusting to a new variable. His attention did not sharpen immediately. It calibrated. Athena recognized the signs, surveillance that did not intrude but noted, inquiries framed as routine, data collection conducted through intermediaries who never appeared to have a purpose. She was not followed, she was tracked. The distinction mattered. Athena adjusted her routines accordingly, not to evade but to observe the parameters. She wanted to understand how much of her movement triggered response, how quickly information propagated. The surveillance was clean, professional, designed to avoid escalation. This was not intimidation, it was evaluation. She had become interesting. The convergence of interests became impossible to ignore. Her return coincided too precisely with renewed pressure on the pharmaceutical company. Her presence intersected too neatly with the emergence of questions surrounding the Hunt family's youngest member. Someone had anticipated this moment long before she stepped onto American soil. Athena did not confront anyone. She did not reveal her awareness. Instead, she consolidated her position. She secured legal counsel without alerting existing networks. She reorganized access to her medical credentials, ensuring her indispensability within critical systems. She established redundancies for her children, layers of protection that did not rely on visibility or appeal. Her past no longer frightened her. What frightened her was ignorance. She began to reconstruct the timeline with forensic precision. The pregnancy, the medical oversight, the institutional decisions made without her presence, the disappearance of one child from accessible records. Each detail suggested coordination rather than neglect. The conclusion was unavoidable. Her life had been intersected by a larger design, one that had not required her consent to function. The truth did not present itself as revelation. It assembled slowly, like a structure emerging from fog. Justin Hunt was not an enemy by default. That assumption would have been simplistic. He was a stakeholder, a man operating within a system that rewarded acquisition and control. His interest in Athena did not stem from desire or nostalgia. It stemmed from anomaly. She represented a variable that had not behaved as expected. Variables demanded resolution. Athena understood him better than he understood her. She had lived inside control long enough to recognize its signatures. She knew when power believed itself benevolent. She knew when it justified its actions through necessity. She knew when it confused protection with ownership. The decision before her crystallized with brutal clarity. She could disappear again, dissolve into another identity, retreat before the system fully oriented itself toward her. That option remained viable. She had planned for it. Or she could remain. Staying did not mean confrontation. It meant engagement on her own terms. It meant refusing to be repositioned as an asset or liability. It meant asserting authorship over the narrative that had been written without her participation. Athena chose to stay. Not because she underestimated the danger, but because she finally possessed what had been denied to her in childhood: agency, discernment, the capacity to protect not just herself, but those who depended on her. She no longer needed to be invisible to survive. She needed to be precise. The shadow she stepped into was not the one she had fled years ago. It was a deeper, more complex space where power negotiated with itself and consequences accumulated quietly. Athena entered it without spectacle, carrying knowledge rather than fear. The first cycle of her story concluded not with resolution, but with alignment. She understood the board now. She recognized the players. And for the first time, she occupied a position that could not be removed without resistance. The woman once defined, as Zero had returned not to reclaim what was taken, but to determine what would happen next. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.